Start your habit of continuous learning today. Visit nomadphp.com. Greetings and welcome to Nomad PHP Lightning Talks. My name is Cal Evans. I'm your host for this Lightning Talk. Nomad PHP Lightning Talks are a short introduction to a single topic or a single concept. Tonight we have with us my friend Amanda Folson, and she's going to talk about 10 things I hate about your API. So Amanda, let me give you control.
My name is Amanda, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about 10 things I hate about your API. And let's see if I can get rid of iTunes bouncing in the dock. I apologize. So who am I? I'm a developer advocate at GitLab. You might know me as the Lego face or the hot dog head. Either way, I'm an API person. I'm a tinkerer, and you may have seen me around at conferences, writing books, blog posts, typical DevRel stuff. So the first thing I really hate about your API is that your onboarding, really not so good. Your onboarding, it really kind of stinks. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes it's not easy to sign up. It's not really easy to get started. Your Hello World kind of app, your basic app, should not require 500 lines of boilerplate code. If you're doing that, please stop. It should not require a 20-minute tutorial. I should not have to sort through 20 minutes of documentation in order to get started on your API. If you're not providing sample code, this is actually a barrier to entry for people who are trying to get started with your API. So what's the solution here? Make sign up a breeze. If you have UX designers or developer experience designers, have them invest time in this because it really pays off in the long run. You kind of want to get somebody into your API in under 5 minutes, and this is kind of where that sample code comes in. If you can shave that time down even more, that'll actually help you in the long run. So reason number 2, you're not giving people the tools that they need in order to succeed. That's actually pretty bad. So what do I mean by that? You're not providing SDKs, you're not providing quick starts, you're not providing them with the sandbox in order to test things with your API. You're not providing them anywhere to get help. And I see this more often than not. People put an API out there and they're just like, all right, it's out there, have fun, don't bother us. So the solution here is, start providing SDKs or at a minimum sample code. You don't have to go full in to the SDK path. That can get a little complicated, especially if you're doing something simple. You may not need an entire SDK. But ideally, your code samples get more complex than just your typical hello world or run this little dinky curl command to get this response. Provide documentation and sample apps to get started. This will, of course, depend on kind of your platform, depends on how crazy your sample apps can get. But in general, if you can show some real-world examples that are more useful than hello world, that will always be beneficial. Provide a sandbox for people to play in. If you can't do that, allow dummy data. If you're providing a payment processing platform, allow people to use a fake credit card number so that they can test that whole workflow, and basically pretend to make some payments, and make it super easy for people to get help if they're stuck with something. Number 3, your documentation stinks, and this is actually probably the number 1 thing I see with APIs, but it's number 3 in this presentation. The problem, out of date or just plain inaccurate documentation, it's incomplete or it's just not useful. Again, no easy way to get started and get your questions answered. So step 1, have docs. There are a lot of people that just put an API out there and they're just like, yeah, people will figure it out. They'll see the data and they'll figure out what to do with it. No, that's really not good enough. You can actually do a lot better than that. Tools like Swagger, Apiary, Raml will help you out a lot with stuff like that. They can kind of keep track of changes between your API and what's going on there and kind of your documentation. You can use them to build your documentation. Sometimes you can even use to build your SDK. So definitely take a look at those if you haven't already. Make documentation part of your API strategy. It's not enough to just put the API out there. You need to be thinking about how people are going to be using this thing as well. So incorporate documentation as part of your whole deployment strategy. And add quick starts and tutorials for people to play with, just to get them sucked into your API. And even if they're not going to play with the code samples, they'll read the information and see, oh, well, hey, maybe this API will actually meet my needs, and that's great for you. Number 4, you're using your API as a sales tool instead of a success tool, and there are some exceptions to this, which I'll talk about. But don't treat your API as a lead gen tool, please. If your API is not your main product, then you shouldn't be dumping people into newsletters and things just for signing up to your API. Now, I'm not saying you can't send them developer-focused content. So, for example, I've actually had a lot of success with sending people, we called it the What Are You Building campaign, where when somebody created an API key, we'd email them a few days later and be like, hey, just want to know what you're building. You know, is there any way we can help you out with this? You might find these few things useful. But it wasn't a marketing campaign. It was more soliciting feedback, and we actually had a really good response rate with that. So if people sign up for your API, that doesn't automatically mean that they want to be opted into your newsletter. It doesn't mean that, you know, you should be trying to upsell them on things. You know, I'm just the developer. Stop trying to sell me things. I'm already here. So the solution, unless you're an API-first company, don't do these things. Exceptions would be Twilio and Mailgun, companies kind of selling their API as a service. The API should be more marketed as a feature rather than, you know, used as you know, the whole sales funnel here. Number 5, your API isn't reliable, and that means a few different things. Your uptime might be terrible. Your API might actually be very slow to respond. You don't announce breaking changes, so things just kind of fall over randomly. There might be too many bugs. Things might be too inconsistent. It might have a really inconsistent experience, which we'll talk about in a second. So invest time to make sure your API is robust. You know, invest time in fixing those bugs. Invest time in speeding things up, maybe speeding up some of those slower queries. Stop making unannounced breaking changes. Please, please, please have some sort of place where people can see breaking changes. Ideally, you'd get into versioning. Versioning could actually probably be its own talk, but so I'm not going to get too far into that. And invest the time to design your API. Really think about how you're going to put this out there, how people are going to be consuming it. So let's talk about that design. You know, number 6, your API is poorly designed, and that comes in a few different ways as well. Sometimes your endpoints make no sense. So we'll pretend we have a fake app here where we have users and orders, and those are 2 endpoints. But users always own orders, and in our fake happy world, you know, you don't have an order without a user. So you might do something like users/ID/orders and make orders a sub-resource of users. Be thinking about things like that, because sometimes it doesn't make sense to have these things as their own endpoints because you're always going to have some data from the other thing involved in this query. Sometimes your endpoints might have inconsistent data, so you might have this user's endpoint that has creation_date, or you might have this orders endpoint that has created-date. That's an inconsistency, and it might not seem like a huge deal, but it actually kind of is. Especially if you have bad documentation, then people have to kind of go through these things and figure them out for themselves. So the solution here is to take kind of a design-first approach, and there's tons of information out there on doing so. Map out your endpoints logically. You know, I do this on paper. I will sit there and draw out an API. Tools like Apiary and Swagger and Bramble can also help you with this. And those tools can even allow you to kind of set up a mock API so that you can even send that to people, and they can make requests and, you know, tell you how they feel about it. And kind of design for a uniform experience. You want your endpoints to kind of feel similar, even if they're not displaying the same data. Number 7, your API isn't meeting your users' needs. And I actually run into this an awful lot. So build something that people want or ideally need. Your API might be missing important features. You're not incorporating feedback from people, maybe not fixing their bugs, maybe not adding functionality that they actually depend on in their own businesses. So you might be building for yourselves and not your users. And if you're building an internal API, then maybe that makes a lot of sense. But a lot of people are not building internal APIs. They're building things that they expect other outside people to be using. So the solution here is to involve users in that discussion from the start. Don't be afraid to alpha and beta test. Like I said, if you're using something like Bramble, Apiary, Swagger, you can actually build mock APIs that people can interact with, and you don't actually even have to write any code. And above all else, don't stop listening to people. Always be listening to people. Always be sourcing feedback and looking to do better. And that's true of things beyond just APIs, by the way. Number 8, your API doesn't use best practices. And there's a larger conversation here to have about, you know, REST versus SOAP versus RPC, but I'm not even going to get into that. However, I will be talking about, you know, REST specifically here, just for the sake of example. So the problem is you might be using the wrong status codes. I see a lot of 200 OK for everything. Anytime an API client is able to talk to a server somewhere, people consider that 200 OK because some sort of information exchange was made. And that's really kind of not OK because, you know, there's a lot more to that request. You know, it not have been a bad request. You need to tell people that. People using really bad error messages. I see a lot of just numeric status codes that don't actually mean anything. They're hard to Google for. It's really difficult to actually find help with some of these things. people tend to market their RESTful APIs as RESTful APIs, but they're not actually all that RESTful. And we're a bunch of nerds, and we're opinionated, and we have strong feelings about things like that when we feel lied to. So the solution here: start using status codes that kind of explain the errors a little bit more. I mean, there's a ton of status codes out there that can help you with this. 404 not found. If a resource isn't found, then that's a perfectly valid thing to show. Unauthorized, or the 500 series, if we broke stuff, please come back and talk to us later. So bad request is kind of not a great error message. Tell me what's bad about it. Is a field required? Did I format the data improperly? That's a bit more useful than just relying on a status code itself. When I talked about people marketing things as RESTful without actually being RESTful, if you have an RPC-like endpoint, such as shutdown, that's not all that RESTful, but be honest about it. Don't lie to people, for sure. And sometimes this is necessary. In some cases, it doesn't actually make a whole bunch of sense to create a completely separate RPC-ish API thing just to do that one thing. Sometimes it makes sense to incorporate that into your REST API. And that's okay. Just make sure that people know about that, and make sure you call attention to it. Number 9, you don't care about security. This would actually probably be one of the first things you look into. And I see a lot of people who don't use SSL. And, folks, it's 2016. Let's encrypt. Let's get to it. Start doing SSL. There's no reason to not protect the traffic between you and clients. See a lot of people still rolling their own auth or crypto, and the solution is stop doing these things, obviously. Or more seriously, start using SSL. Stop rolling your own crypto solutions, please. Please stop doing it. And hire consultants. There are people that get paid to audit things just like this. And, yeah, it's going to cost you a bit of money up front, but it could potentially save you millions. If it prevents a crazy breach from happening, then, yeah, you spend a few $1,000s, but you saved millions. And number 10, your API isn't maintained. And this is kind of an unfortunate situation. People, they put the API out there and they're like, all right, it's out there, we're good to go, and then they stop providing bug fixes. They don't release new endpoints as their product changes. There's no documentation updates, and the solution here is to plan to maintain your API. If you're putting it out there, it's kind of a contract between you and the people who are using this, that it's going to be there, you're going to maintain it, you will incorporate feedback in it, your documentation will be up to date, people will be able to get support, they can expect some bug fixes. So include that as part of your post-API release. Be sure that you are actually allocating resources to deal with all these things. So that is 10 things that I really dislike about your API that you can fix, and that I and other developers will be very happy for you and happy to use your API if you actually do these things. So thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat.
Thank you, Amanda. Boy, you took the term lightning talk to heart. We do lightning talks every Nomad PHP. We try to do one in the US and one in the European chapter meetings. If you'd like to give a Nomad PHP lightning talk, we'd love to hear from you. Email joe@nomadphp.com. And to see our entire collection, visit our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/nomadphp. All the lightning talks that we have ever recorded are all released there for your viewing.